In this quiet, old-fashioned town of Rockdale Township, Pennsylvania, where the Amish embrace a life of simplicity, a nightmare unfolded that no one could have ever imagined. The Amish are known for their peaceful way of life, where violence is rare and murder is practically unheard of. But then came Edward Gingerich, a man who would shatter that history in the most brutal and disturbing way possible. He didn't just kill someone. He carved out his victims' organs and stacked them in a grotesque display, leaving behind a crime scene so horrifying that even seasoned investigators were shaken, and it made Edward the first recorded Amish murderer in over 200 years. Of all the cases we've uncovered, this is one that will stick with you for days, making you wonder, if Edward had been taken to a modern doctor sooner, could this tragedy have been prevented? You can let me know your thoughts once you hear the full story, because trust me, this is as tragic as the mind of the man who committed it. For starters, Edward was one of 11 children, born into a deeply traditional Amish family. When he was 18 years old, his family packed up and moved to Crawford County, Pennsylvania in 1983. Life in an Amish community is all about simplicity, faith, and following strict rules. But from a young age, Edward never quite fit the mold. While most Amish boys grew up learning farming and carpentry, Edward had an unusual fascination with machinery, something that wasn't exactly encouraged in his world. He worked at his family's sawmill, where he quickly developed a reputation as a master mechanic. He had a special talent for fixing diesel engines, something rare for someone in his community. In fact, people often said, "If something's broken, just take it to Ed. He'll fix it better than anyone else." But his curiosity didn't stop with machines. He also had an interest in the outside world, something that made him stand out even more. Unlike most Amish men, Edward started spending time with non-Amish locals, forming friendships that others in his community wouldn't dare to. One of his closest friends was Dave Lindsay, an outsider with whom he felt comfortable enough to admit something shocking. He didn't really like the Amish way of life. This was a huge deal. The Amish are taught from birth that their way of life is sacred, that the outside world is filled with temptation and sin. For Edward to openly say he didn't want to be a part of it, that was unheard of. But then Katie Shetler entered the picture. Katie was the daughter of a highly respected Amish elder, and from the start, their relationship raised eyebrows. People whispered that Katie was too good for Edward, that his rebellious nature would cause trouble. But despite the rumors, family pressure pushed Edward to propose. The Amish believe in strong, traditional marriages, and backing out wasn't really an option. So, on a rainy day in 1986, Edward asked Katie to marry him. By the spring of 1987, they were officially husband and wife. At first, it seemed like Edward was settling into married life, just like everyone expected. Katie became pregnant soon after, and before long, she gave birth to their first child, a son named Danny, after Edward's father. From the outside, it looked like Edward was on the right path, married, working, raising a family. But beneath the surface, something was changing. Edward started to pull away from his community. He became distant, withdrawn, spending more and more time alone. It wasn't just that he missed his old friendships or his interest in machinery. This was different. The once outgoing, talkative Edward was now a man who barely spoke. He avoided gatherings, lost interest in his work, and started acting in ways that confused and worried those around him. Naturally, concern for Edward grew among his family and the Amish community. But in typical Amish fashion, they chose to support him the best way they knew how, staying close, offering quiet encouragement, and hoping for the best. What no one could have predicted, though, was that Edward's detachment was just the beginning. Because by July of 1988, Edward's condition took a disturbing turn. Dizzy spells became frequent, and he was sleeping an abnormal amount, sometimes for entire days. His worried wife, Katie, reached out for help, but in their Amish way of life, modern medicine was a last resort. Instead, they turned to a trusted chiropractor, a man favored by the Amish for his natural, drug-free remedies. His solution? Toe pulling, foot rubs, and a jar of molasses, the latter meant to purify his blood. The cost? $25. Now let's be real, none of that was going to work. But Edward, desperate and with no other options, went through with it anyway. Despite multiple visits to the chiropractor and more molasses than anyone should ever have to consume, his condition didn't improve. But just when it seemed like everything was falling apart, a flicker of hope appeared. In 1989, Katie gave birth to their second son, and by 1990, they welcomed a daughter. For a moment, it seemed like life might settle down. But Edward, he was already too far gone. His presence in the family became almost non-existent. He avoided his wife and children, showing little to no interest in them. It wasn't just emotional distance. He became physically absent too, even refusing to sleep with Katie for fear she would become pregnant again. And when he did speak, it was only to mutter strange things under his breath. Things about darkness, about visions, about something coming. By the time 1991 rolled around, Edward was barely a shadow of the man he used to be. His physical health had taken a drastic hit. His once strong and capable hands now trembled with an eerie frailty. His skin had turned pale, almost translucent, and the hollowness in his eyes made it seem like he was peering into a world that no one else could see. Then, as if fate hadn't already dealt him a cruel enough hand, things got even worse. While working in his machine shop, he was exposed to toxic solvents, which only pushed his already fragile body further toward the edge. But here's the thing. The most terrifying changes weren't happening to his body. They were happening to his mind. At first, the signs were subtle, almost easy to brush off. He would mumble to himself under his breath, his words barely decipherable, just a low, constant whisper that unnerved anyone who happened to overhear. But then the whispers grew, became more urgent, more frantic. He started answering questions no one had asked, responding to voices no one else could hear. Then came the laughter, soft at first, then suddenly erupting into maniacal fits that would shake his entire body. His family would find him staring into the distance, lips moving but making no sound, his expression one of pure, unfiltered terror. But the worst was yet to come. One night, without warning, Edward dropped to all fours and began racing around the living room like a wild animal. He howled, an inhuman, guttural sound that sent chills down the spines of everyone in the house. His eyes darted around wildly as if he were seeing things that weren't there. And then, in a voice that wasn't quite his own, he started raving about giant rabbits with glowing eyes lurking in the dark corners of the house. He swore they were watching him, waiting for him. And if that wasn't disturbing enough, his ramblings took on an even darker tone. He began shouting, screaming really, about a war between God and Satan, a battle being waged for his very soul. His family could only watch in horror, unable to do anything but pray that whatever was happening to him would pass. But it didn't. It got worse. By 1992, Edward had descended into full-blown madness. His episodes became unpredictable, violent, and completely unhinged that he could no longer be left alone with his wife and children. At this point, they knew he needed medical intervention. But getting him to a hospital was no easy task. Edward resisted with everything he had, refusing to go willingly. His strength, fueled by some unseen force, was so overwhelming that his family was left with only one option. They had to hog-tie him just to get him into the car. When they arrived at the emergency room, chaos erupted. The moment they freed him, Edward snapped. He lunged at nurses, sent medical equipment flying, and thrashed so violently that it took multiple people to hold him down. The medical staff had no choice but to sedate him, finally bringing his madness to a temporary halt. Doctors diagnosed him with a severe psychotic disorder and prescribed antipsychotic medication to calm his symptoms. And for a time, it worked. The terrifying visions faded, the violent episodes ceased. but Edward hated the way the drugs made him feel. He described it as being trapped in a slow, foggy world, his body sluggish and his thoughts weighed down. He felt like a zombie, stripped of whatever was left of his identity. And so, like so many before him, Edward made a fateful decision. He stopped taking the medication. Edward's descent into madness reached terrifying depths in the early months of 1993. His mental health had deteriorated so drastically that his wife, Katie, was desperate for any kind of help. In March, she took him to see a well-respected Amish healer named Jacob Troyer, hoping for some kind of remedy. But Troyer took one look at Edward and knew that whatever was afflicting him was beyond any herbal cure or spiritual healing. His words were blunt and chilling. "Your husband has a mental problem. Take him to a hospital. I'm afraid of suicide. Goodbye, and good luck." But whether it was fear, denial, or simply the way the Amish avoided outsiders, Katie didn't take him to a hospital. Instead, the next morning, Edward was taken to a chiropractor. The chiropractor massaged Edward's scalp, gave him some liver pills, and sent him on his way. A man whose mind was on the verge of complete collapse was given a head rub and some pills meant for digestion. Edward was drowning, and everyone around him was pretending he could just float back to the surface on his own. Now, as mentioned earlier, Edward didn't have many non-Amish friends, but one of the few he did have was a man named David Lindsay. David was a born-again Christian, deeply passionate about his faith, and determined to save lost souls. When he met Edward at the sawmill, he saw him as someone who needed to be rescued. David wasn't just trying to be a friend, he was trying to convert Edward. He told him that unless he left the Amish faith and became a born-again Christian, he would go to hell. Other evangelists who visited the woodshop repeated the same warnings, pushing Edward to believe that he was trapped, that his wife, his family, and his entire Amish way of life were keeping him prisoner. Edward's mind was already fragile, but these words sent him spiraling further. His paranoia grew. The thoughts that had once been mere whispers in his mind became deafening screams, and soon he began to see his own wife as something far worse than just an obstacle. To Edward, Katie was no longer just the woman who stood in his way. She was the devil. So, on the morning of May 18, 1993, something inside Edward finally snapped. He had been drowning in depression for months, his mind slipping further into darkness. But that day, it was different. Something evil had taken hold. The weight of his torment became unbearable, and as he stood in the kitchen, watching his wife, Katie, go about her morning, a violent storm erupted within him. Without warning, he struck. His fist slammed into her face with brutal force, sending her crashing to the ground. "I am the devil," he screamed. Katie knew she had to act fast. She turned to her 6-year-old son, Danny, saying, "Run! Get Uncle Dan, now!" Danny didn't hesitate. He bolted out the door, his little feet pounding against the ground as he raced to his uncle's house. When he got there, breathless and wide-eyed, he could barely form the words saying, "Daddy isn't well." Dan had seen his brother in dark moments before, but this time, something in his nephew's voice sent a shiver down his spine. This wasn't just another one of Edward's breakdowns. This was something much worse. He ran toward the house, hoping, praying he wasn't too late. But the moment he stepped inside, those prayers were shattered. The scene before him was straight out of a nightmare. Edward was on top of Katie, his fists hammering into her face over and over again. The sound of flesh meeting bone was sickening, and with every brutal hit, blood sprayed across the walls, the floor, even the ceiling. It was pure, unrelenting violence. Bones cracked beneath Edward's relentless assault, their sharp snaps echoing through the house like the breaking of twigs. Later, when paramedics arrived, they would say Katie's face was so utterly destroyed that she was unrecognizable. Dan wanted to stop it. He wanted to do something, but the brother he knew was gone. What stood before him was a monster, lost in pure, uncontrollable rage. Before he could react, Edward stood up, lifted his boot, and with terrifying force, stomped down on Katie's face. The crack that followed was sickening, the sound of bones turning to dust beneath his weight. Dan's stomach twisted. His mind screamed at him to intervene, but fear won. He turned and ran, bolting for help. But if you were Dan at that moment, what would you have done? Would you have stepped in, or would fear have paralyzed you? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because the horror was far from over. Edward stood there for a moment. Then, with chilling calmness, he walked to the corner of the room, slipped on his heavy work boots, and returned to his wife's shattered body. And then he stomped again, and again, and again. Each blow crushed what little remained of her skull until her head was no longer a head, just a mess of blood, bone, and flesh. But even that wasn't enough. Something snapped inside Edward. Moving with eerie precision, he stripped Katie's body of its clothes, then walked to the kitchen. His blood-soaked hands reached for a steak knife, fingers curling around the handle as if it were just another tool in his collection. Without hesitation, he plunged the blade into her abdomen and dragged it downward, cutting through skin, muscle, and tissue. Blood poured onto the floor, thick and dark, pooling around his feet. But Edward didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. His hands disappeared inside her, and then, in a moment so horrifying it defied all human logic, he began pulling her apart. One by one he removed her organs, her heart, her lungs, her liver, her kidneys, her spleen, her intestines. Each one, dripping with blood, was carefully placed in a neat, methodical pile beside her body. It was surgical, calculated, like he was completing a task rather than committing an atrocity. When it was over, he stood up, wiped his hands on his shirt, and walked to the sink. He turned on the water, letting the deep red stain swirl down the drain, as if washing away all evidence of his monstrous act. Then, as if it were just another day, he picked up his Bible, walked over to the fireplace, and threw it into the flames. After that, Edward turned to his 4-year-old son and 3-year-old daughter, their small faces frozen in fear. In a disturbingly calm voice, he told them to put on their coats, saying they were going to their grandfather's house. Then, almost as an afterthought, he added that he would come back to burn the house down. But fate had other plans. He never got the chance. The ambulance crew had already been warned that the scene was unsafe. The call described a disturbed man, with whispers that Edward was inside, killing his wife. Assistant Fire Chief Andrew McLaughlin immediately recognized the name. He had been to the household about a year earlier and had seen Edward in one of his terrifying episodes, howling like a wild animal, cackling, spitting, and lashing out as his family and paramedics struggled to restrain him. McLaughlin had been in the ambulance with Edward that day and remembered the chilling words he had whispered. "My heart is loose. I'm drowning on the inside." This time, the emergency team braced for another violent outburst, but when they found Edward walking calmly down the road with his 2 children, he was eerily quiet. He simply told them that his father would understand. However, when McLaughlin finally arrived at the Gingerich home, nothing could have prepared him for the nightmare inside. Katie's naked body lay sprawled on the floor, her skull shattered beyond recognition. Her internal organs were carefully arranged beside her, a grotesque and chilling sight. McLaughlin, horrified, immediately radioed his crew, ordering them to call the police and keep a close eye on Edward. The brutality of the scene was so overwhelming that one of the EMTs ran outside and vomited. When the police arrived, Edward was promptly arrested. He was read his rights, but he didn't resist. Instead, he freely admitted to killing his wife, as if it was a simple fact. At the station, officers ordered him to remove his boots and coat for evidence. As he did, a piece of flesh fell from his boot, a sickening reminder of what he had done. Even in custody, lost in his delusions, he muttered to the officers, For some reason, I think we could still save her. It was only after his arrest that doctors finally diagnosed Edward with paranoid schizophrenia. A name was finally given to the illness that had tormented him for so long. But the diagnosis had come far too late to save Katie, too late to undo the horror he had unleashed. Neither the prosecution nor the defense ever disputed that Edward Gingerich had killed his wife. The evidence was clear, the crime undeniable. However, the argument was never about whether he did it. It was about why he did it. His attorney, Donald Lewis, painted a harrowing picture of a man trapped in the grips of severe mental illness, unable to comprehend reality, let alone his own actions. Edward pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity, a claim backed by chilling accounts of his deteriorating mental state. Edward had begged for help again and again to his father, to his wife, to his brothers. He spoke of the unbearable headaches that tormented him, of his growing fear that God had abandoned him, and of the dark presence he believed had taken hold of him. He was desperate, spiraling, but no one understood the true depth of his suffering. No one realized the horror that was coming. His wife, Katie, had lived in quiet submission, as was expected in their Amish community. She was a devoted mother and wife, but her husband was becoming more erratic by the day. Even as Edward's mind crumbled under the weight of his delusions, the Amish way of life rejected modern medicine. Instead of psychiatric care, he was treated by a chiropractor who, for 6 months, massaged his scalp and gave him molasses. Hours before Katie's death, that same chiropractor had treated Edward again, completely unaware of the monster brewing beneath his troubled surface. Then, it happened. Edward's psychosis reached its breaking point in the most horrific way imaginable. When the fog lifted, Katie was dead. The brutality of the murder shocked even the most hardened individuals. But was it the act of a cold-blooded killer, or was it the tragic consequence of untreated mental illness? In the year 1994, Edward was convicted of involuntary manslaughter, but mentally ill. He was sentenced to 5 years in the prison ward of a mental hospital. The Amish community and the public at large were outraged. Many believed this sentence was far too lenient for such a horrific crime. Mental health professionals and even members of his own community feared what would happen once Edward was released. Yet, there were others who took a different view. Some of Edward's fellow Amish saw his punishment as just, arguing that modern medicine had restored his sanity. They believed he was truly remorseful, that he deserved the opportunity to repent, and that with proper guidance, he could return to the community. Some even offered to take him in, pledging to supervise him. Against public outcry, Edward was released in the year 1998. He was placed in an Amish mental care facility in Michigan, but after an unspecified incident, he was transferred to an Indiana psychiatric unit designated for Amish individuals who required constant supervision. Still, he longed to return home. He wanted to see his children. He wanted to rebuild his life. Eventually, Edward moved back to Crawford County, but the life he had once known was gone. Though 2 of his brothers and his teenage sons had reconciled with him, the rest of the Amish community had not. Edward was shunned, cast out, forced to exist on the fringes of his former life. In the Amish world, shunning isn't just rejection, it's erasure. To be shunned means you are seen but not acknowledged. You are there, yet you do not exist. His teenage daughter, Mary, was placed in the care of her grandparents and was forbidden from seeing him. Anyone who dared associate with Edward risked being shunned themselves. Even his children, innocent as they were not spared. Tensions ran so high that when some of the children attempted to attend a youth prayer meeting, they were arrested for defiant trespass. In April of the year 2007, Edward's desperation reached new heights. He and his sons orchestrated the kidnapping of his 17-year-old daughter, Mary, in a last-ditch attempt to reclaim a piece of the family he had lost. According to an affidavit from Mary's aunt, Clara Gingerich, Mary and Clara had been traveling in a horse-drawn buggy when Edward's brother, Dan, suddenly leapt onto the wagon, seized the reins, and redirected them toward another Gingerich brothers' property. As they neared the barn, Mary's brother grabbed the horses, leading them inside, where Edward and his other brothers were waiting. Surrounded and outnumbered, Mary was given an ultimatum: leave willingly with her father, or the police would force her to go with him. Convinced she had no choice, she went. For 5 days, Mary was missing. To many in the Amish community, the nightmare was repeating itself. A vulnerable young woman was in the hands of the same man who had murdered her mother. Some feared that Edward had suffered another psychotic break, that history would repeat itself in blood. When Mary was finally found, safe but shaken, Edward faced legal consequences once again. However, his punishment was shockingly light. He pleaded no contest to concealing the whereabouts of a child and was sentenced to just 6 months of probation and a $500 fine. Despite regaining contact with some of his family, Edward remained an outcast. He could never fully return to his old life. For an Amish man, exile was a punishment far worse than prison. It was social death. Edward struggled with his guilt for years. He was haunted by the reality that his family could never fully embrace him without risking their own place in the community. His depression deepened, and he became more isolated. His mental state, once stabilized, began to decline once more. Then in the year 2011, nearly 2 decades after the murder of Katie Gingerich, Edward took his own life. He had been living with his attorney for 6 months. One day, the attorney's wife went out to the barn and found Edward's lifeless body hanging. He had left behind only one final message, scrawled in the dust on top of a bucket: "Forgive me, please." In a twist of irony, Edward was finally welcomed back into the Amish community after his death. He was buried beside Katie in an Amish cemetery, a gesture of reconciliation that sparked just as much controversy as his life had. Some saw it as an act of mercy, a way to finally grant him peace. Others saw it as an insult to Katie's memory. Despite their differing views, the Amish community gathered from far and wide to attend the funeral. They stood together in grief, offering support to Edward's brothers and sons. Now that he was gone, his family was no longer outcasts. They could return. They could belong again. And so, the tragic chapter of Edward Gingerich finally came to a close. As you probably already know, the Amish are known for their simple way of life, rejecting modern conveniences and relying on their faith to guide them. But in Edward's case, their rejection of modern medicine may have sealed his fate and that of his wife. Had he received proper psychiatric care instead of natural remedies, Katie might still be alive. So, what do you think? Could this tragedy have been prevented if they had just taken him to a hospital? Was this a case of untreated mental illness, or was something more at play? Drop your thoughts below. It was a quiet neighborhood in Kirkland, Washington, a place where families thrived, where children played without fear. But on the night of July 17, 2006, something unimaginable happened. The 911 call came in at 11:32 a.m. The house of a Ukrainian family was on fire. When firefighters arrived, they had no idea that inside, beneath the collapsing structure, lay a horror beyond belief. In the peaceful neighborhood near Forbes Lake in Kirkland, Washington, the Milkin family lived what many would call the American dream. Their home was filled with love, laughter, and the warmth of a life well built, until a tragic event wiped them out in an instant. At the heart of the family was Leonid Leo Milkin, a dedicated sergeant in the Washington National Guard. His journey began in 1989 when he and his family emigrated from Ukraine, embracing the promise of a new life in the United States. By 2006, Leo was serving in Iraq, facing the harsh realities of war with unwavering strength. But no matter how far he was from home, his heart remained with his family, counting down the 6 weeks until he could finally return to them. He was deeply loved and supported by his dear wife Olga. Born on July 22, 1977, Olga was not only a devoted wife but also a nurturing mother and a professional in her own right. She worked as a dental assistant in Bellevue, balancing her career with the responsibilities of raising 2 young sons. Described by neighbors as friendly and outgoing, Olga had an innate ability to make those around her feel welcomed and valued. The couple had 2 beloved sons. 5-year-old Justin and 3-year-old Andrew were the heartbeats of the Milkin household. Their playful energy often led them to the shores of Forbes Lake, where they spent summer holidays swimming. Justin, in particular, took immense pride in his father's military service, often sharing with others, quote, "He's in the military service." These kids were not only loved deeply by their parents, but their aunt and Olga's sister would also spoil them rotten. At 24, Lyubov, Olga's younger sister, was a beacon of ambition and kindness. A sophomore at Seattle Pacific University, she was pursuing a bachelor's degree in foreign languages. Known for her generosity and a solid belief in the goodness of people, Lyubov was a cherished friend to many. She frequently visited the Milkin family out of love for her nephews, Andrew and Justin. The Milkin family's journey from Ukraine to the United States was a difficult one. However, with their resilience and love for life, the family was able to rebuild their life from scratch. Settling in Mill Creek, Washington, they became integral members of the local Russian-Ukrainian community. Their home was a sanctuary of love, dreams, and an amalgamation of cultures, a place where their past and future was intertwined in harmony. Tragically, their story was cut short on July 17, 2006, when an unimaginable act shattered their world. When firefighters finally contained the blaze and entered the ruins of a family's dreams, they found the bodies. But they hadn't died in the fire. What took their lives would remain a mystery for a minute before the bodies were found, each telling a story of a brutal truth. Each victim had been brutally stabbed multiple times. Their wounds were vicious, merciless. The children's throats had been slashed. Whoever did this wanted them to suffer. It didn't take long for the police to find their prime suspect, and the discovery will be shocking to the whole neighborhood. Connor M. Shearman, a 24-year-old neighbor, a man who had moved in just 2 weeks earlier across the street from the Milkin home. Witnesses had seen him lurking around the property, carrying a red gasoline container before the fire erupted. But the most chilling detail? The deep scratches on his face, as if he had been in a struggle, as if someone had tried to survive his monstrosity that night. Shearman was arrested on July 19th, 2 days after the murder. When questioned, he admitted to setting the fire. But the murders, he claimed he had no memory of them. Shearman said he had blacked out from drinking heavily that night, downing 3 bottles of vodka. He only remembered waking up in the Milkin home, surrounded by the dead. So who was Connor Shearman? You might wonder. Connor Michael Shearman, born in Bellevue, Washington, was 24 years old at the time of the heinous crimes committed in July 2006. Someone who seemed like a friendly neighbor next door would turn out to be a heinous criminal. But deep inside lay a monster who kept logs on the family next door and planned to wipe it out from the face of this planet. Connor was even found buying equipment for starting a fire in the CCTV that will be discovered later by the law enforcement. Was it a hate crime or a mere voice of monstrosity inside him? The nation will wonder for years to come. However, before committing these murders, Shearman had no significant criminal record. His sudden and brutal actions on July 17, 2006, shocked the community, leading to his arrest and subsequent conviction for the murders of Olga Milkin, her 2 young sons, Justin and Andrew, and her sister, Lyubov Botvina. Shearman's version of events was almost too convenient. He admitted to taking a shower in the Milkin home. He admitted to changing into hospital scrubs he found inside. He admitted to buying gasoline and burning the house down, deliberately covering his tracks. But he would never admit to the murders themselves. Instead, he begged the jury to believe him. However, the evidence against him was overwhelming. As investigators took a dive into the aftermath of the Milkin family tragedy, They meticulously gathered evidence that would later become crucial in the prosecution of Connor Shearman. The crime scene, though ravaged by fire, brought up several critical findings. Number 1, the hunting knife. Amidst the charred remains of the Milkin residence, a hunting knife was discovered at the foot of the stairs. This weapon, bearing traces of blood, was identified as the instrument used in the brutal stabbings of Olga, Justin, Andrew, and Lyubov. Number 2, blood-stained clothing. In the master bedroom, where the bodies of Olga and Lyubov were found, investigators recovered clothing heavily stained with blood. These garments provided DNA evidence linking Shearman directly to the crime scene. Number 3, the flashlight. A flashlight found in the same bedroom suggested premeditation. Its presence indicated that Shearman had equipped himself to navigate the darkened house, which further bore the story of him in the planned intrusion. Number 4, the partially burned glove. A glove, partially consumed by the fire, was located near the victims. This item not only placed Shearman at the scene, but also indicated an attempt to conceal fingerprints during his evil murder spree that swallowed a whole family. Number 5, surveillance footage. Security cameras captured Shearman purchasing gasoline from a nearby station shortly before the fire was reported. This footage corroborated the timeline and his intent to destroy evidence by setting the house ablaze. Number 6, physical injuries. Observations made during Shearman's arrest noted fresh cuts and scratches on his face and neck. These injuries were consistent with defensive wounds inflicted by the victims during the struggle, further linking him to the heinous act. The conclusion was horrifying yet simple. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a drunken mistake. This was a massacre, a crime committed in cold blood that was both pre-planned and done in pure brutality. 3 years later, the court trial of Connor Shearman began. Jury selection alone took weeks. The death penalty was on the table. Prosecutors argued that Shearman had planned the attack, that he had entered the home armed with the intent to kill, that he had wiped out an entire family in cold blood. And then, he tried to erase his crime with fire. Shearman's defense team played the only card they had: alcohol-induced blackout. They brought in addiction experts, psychiatrists, and toxicologists to argue that Shearman had been too intoxicated to form intent, that he couldn't remember killing anyone because his mind had blacked it out. Whether it was a genuine concern for Shearman or a mere effort to save him from merciless punishment, the jury did not buy it. During the penalty phase, Shearman took the stand. In a 25-minute emotional plea, he asked the jury for mercy. He apologized to the victims' families. He admitted to burning the house, but he never once confessed to the murders. Dressed in standard prison attire, Shearman appeared markedly different from the man who had been arrested years prior. His demeanor was subdued, his face etched with lines of remorse and anxiety. As he began to speak, his voice wavered, and he frequently dabbed at his eyes with a tissue, attempting to maintain composure while also showing remorse through his sunken posture. "I know you don't want my words. I know you don't want my tears," Shearman began, his voice barely above a whisper. "You want your family back. I can't give them back to you." Each word seemed to weigh heavily upon him, as if he were grappling with the enormity of his actions in real time, or just that he was a really good actor. He paused. The silence lingered in the courtroom as everyone awaited his next words. "I may not have the right to ask anything of you," he continued, "but I'm asking for your mercy. If not for me, then for my family." The plea extended beyond his own life, reaching out on behalf of his mother and sister, who sat in the courtroom. Their faces portrayed anguish and hope at the same time. But what about the innocent family? Everyone else wondered. Throughout his allocution, Shearman refrained from discussing the specifics of the crimes, adhering to legal advice and the constraints of the allocution process, which allows defendants in death penalty cases to speak without facing cross-examination. Instead, he focused on expressing his remorse and the impact of his potential execution on his own family. His words were not enough. As he spoke, the families of the victims sat stoically, their faces reflecting a mixed and complex emotion of pain, anger, and perhaps a yearning for closure. Olga's husband, Leonid Milkin, who had been serving in Iraq at the time of the murders, listened intently, his expressions impossible to understand. The loss he had endured was unimaginable, and now he was confronted with the raw humanity of the man responsible, yet desperate for his mercy. Shearman's defense attorney, James Conroy, had previously presented a narrative of a troubled individual battling alcoholism, suggesting that Shearman had experienced an alcohol-induced blackout during the time of the murders. However, the jury had found this defense unconvincing, leading to the guilty verdicts. Now, in this final moment, Conroy hoped that Shearman's display of remorse might sway the jury toward leniency. The prosecution, led by King County Deputy Prosecutor Scott O'Toole, had painted a starkly different picture. They described Shearman as a calculated killer who had invaded a family's home and committed unspeakable acts. All evidence pointed towards the atrocity of his planned crime. O'Toole had invoked the profound loss experienced by the Milkin family, highlighting the innocence of the young boys whose lives were brutally cut short by this heinous man. As Shearman concluded his allocution, he looked directly at the jury, his eyes pleading. "I have been told by people I'm going to die. I'm going to hell," he said, his voice breaking. "I'm already there." With these final words, he returned to his seat, leaving the jury to grapple with the weight of his plea and the gravity of their impending decision. The courtroom remained silent as the jurors absorbed what they had heard. The decision before them was monumental, balancing the scales of justice, the demands of society, and the remnants of mercy that Shearman's allocution sought to awaken. The lives of many hung in the balance, not just Shearman's, but also those irrevocably changed by his actions. In the days that followed, the jury would deliberate, each member wrestling with their conscience, the law, and the emotional testimonies presented throughout the trial. The allocution had added a deeply personal dimension to their task, humanizing a man convicted of inhuman acts. Their verdict would not only determine Shearman's fate, but also echo through the lives of the victims' families, the Ukrainian community, and the broader discourse on justice and redemption. All eyes were on the jury, waiting for a verdict that did justice to all. In the aftermath of the brutal murders of Olga Milkin, her two sons Justin and Andrew, and her sister Lyubov Botvina, the legal proceedings against Connor Shearman culminated in a highly publicized trial. On April 12, 2010, Shearman was found guilty on 4 counts of aggravated first-degree murder and 1 count of first-degree arson. The only question that remained was, would he live or die? The penalty phase of the trial, which lasted 2 weeks, was emotionally charged. The jury deliberated for a day and a half before unanimously recommending the death penalty. On May 5, 2010, King County Superior Court Judge Gregory Canova formally sentenced Shearman to death by lethal injection. As the verdict was read, Shearman reportedly shook his head, while Leonid Milkin, the surviving husband, father, and brother-in-law of the victims, relieved, expressing a sense of justice being served. Shearman's defense team immediately indicated plans to appeal the verdict to the Washington State Supreme Court, raising concerns about jury selection and statements made by the prosecution during the trial. Shearman's family, present during the sentencing, declined to comment publicly. King County Prosecutor Dan Satterberg spoke to reporters at the family press conference in the King County Prosecutor's office. "The death penalty is the law of this state, and it is reserved for the worst of crimes," said Satterberg, who was not in office when the prosecutors brought the death penalty charge against Shearman. This prosecution team was able to bring that case together for the jury, and the jury made what we believe is the right call. These are wonderful people who come to America to live the dream, and that dream was shattered. Satterberg also called Shearman's acts the worst crimes in the history of this county. He said the day of the sentence was not about Shearman, but rather to remember the lives he took from both families. In 2018, the Washington State Supreme Court ruled the state's death penalty unconstitutional, citing concerns about racial bias and arbitrary application. As a result, Shearman's death sentence was commuted to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. On April 12, 2010, after 9 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict: guilty on all counts, 4 counts of aggravated first-degree murder, 1 count of first-degree arson. Shearman was convicted on 4 separate counts, each corresponding to a victim: Olga Milkin, age 28, the wife of Leonid Milkin and mother to Justin and Andrew; Justin Milkin, age 5, the eldest son of Olga and Leonid; Andrew Milkin, age 3, the youngest son of Olga and Leonid; Lyubov Botvina, age 24, Olga's younger sister. The prosecution highlighted several aggravating factors to elevate the charges: multiple victims, the simultaneous killing of 4 individuals. Vulnerability. The ages of Justin and Andrew highlighted the defenselessness of the victims. Attempt to conceal a crime. The arson was presented as a planned effort to destroy evidence and obscure the murders. Shearman was found guilty of intentionally setting the Milkin residence ablaze following the murders, which also meant that the murder was premeditated. The prosecution argued that the fire was a deliberate act to eliminate evidence and hinder the investigation. The jury deliberated for approximately 9 hours before reaching their unanimous decision. As we discussed before, the jury initially sentenced Shearman to death by lethal injection, but why was his sentence changed to life imprisonment, you may wonder. Following the guilty verdicts, the trial proceeded to the sentencing phase to determine whether Shearman would face the death penalty or life imprisonment without parole. On May 5, 2010, the jury recommended the death penalty for Shearman. This decision was based on the heinous nature of the crimes and the presence of multiple aggravating factors. Subsequently, the presiding judge affirmed the jury's recommendation, officially sentencing Shearman to death. However, subsequent legal developments brought about the change that would alter the course of Shearman's life. The Washington State Supreme Court declared the death penalty unconstitutional in 2018, citing concerns over its arbitrary application and potential racial biases. This landmark decision led to the commutation of all death sentences in the state to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. As a result of this ruling, Shearman's death sentence was converted to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. In the quiet suburb of Kirkland, Washington, a community bore witness to an unimaginable tragedy that would forever alter the life of one man, Sergeant Leonid Milkin. Serving with the Washington National Guard in Iraq, Milkin received devastating news in July 2006. His entire family had been brutally murdered, and their home set ablaze in an attempt to conceal the heinous crime. The victims were his beloved wife, Olga, their 2 young sons, Justin and Andrew, and Olga's sister, Lyubov Botvina. The journey from war to another war at home was filled with grief and questions of why did this happen to him. While in Iraq, dreaming to make his family proud of his work as a sergeant, little did Leonid know his family was being brutally murdered in cold blood by a man that walked into their neighborhood 2 weeks ago. Upon receiving the tragic news, Milkin was granted emergency leave to return home. Still clad in his military fatigues, he arrived to find his residence reduced to charred remains, a haunting consequence of the violence that had occurred. The community mourned alongside him, struggling to comprehend the atrocity that had shattered this family. Why was he put through this unfathomable loss? Everyone in the community desired for closure. In the aftermath, Milkin faced not only a destroyed home, a family that no longer exists, but also the practical challenges of reconstructing his life and the emotional destruction that has left him yearning for peace in his life. His home, once filled with laughter and love, is now a grim symbol of loss However, the ever-resilient sergeant decided to rebuild the life that was taken away from him by a man he barely knew. A man that had no business destroying his life like the way he did. Determined to reclaim it, he has encountered numerous obstacles, including disputes with contractors over a damaged foundation of his beloved house, which led to legal battles and a progress that the contractors keep disrupting. Amidst these challenges, the Kirkland community rallied around Milkin. This was when Leonid needed his community the most. He found them standing beside him, willing to fight for his rights and rebuild his home for him. Led by local veterans and volunteers, efforts were made to rebuild his home. Companies donated materials and labor, which transformed this site of tragedy into a budding home that reflected hope after an injustice done by a man who walked into the family's life and shattered their dreams. A family that came to the United States to rebuild their life was no more, leaving Sergeant Leonid all alone to build it yet again, this time from the charred scratches of his own loving family. By 2010, 4 years after the murders, Milkin prepared to move back into his rebuilt home, viewing it as a memorial to his lost family and a foundation for his future. He now lives there with the memories of his 2 sons and a beloved wife, still wondering why his life was taken away from him when all he wanted was to live peacefully with his family. The Milkin family massacre remains one of the most horrifying crimes in Washington's history, a tragedy that destroyed a family. A crime so senseless, so brutal, that it left an entire community shaken. But what do you think? Was justice truly served, or did Sherman escape the punishment he truly deserved? Let's discuss. And if you want to see more cases like this, I survived the BTK, were the words of Charlie Otero, whose life had just turned upside down. January 15th, 1974, was a bitterly cold morning in Wichita, Kansas. At 15 years old, Charlie Otero had no idea that as he walked home from school that day with 2 of his other siblings, he was stepping into a nightmare, one that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The first thing Charlie Otero noticed was the dog. Lucky was outside. That wasn't right. He and his siblings had just walked home from school, expecting to find their mother waiting, maybe cooking, their father watching the news maybe, their younger siblings playing. Instead, Lucky was out in the cold, pacing. His stomach tightened. Something was wrong. Charlie went straight to the back door, pushing it open. The house was silent, too silent. He stepped into the kitchen, and that's when he saw it. His mother's purse flipped over on the stove, the things inside scattered everywhere. His mother was meticulous. She never left things like this. "Is anybody home?" he called out. Silence. Then, one of his siblings' voices echoed through the house. "Charlie, come quick! Mom and Dad are playing a bad trick on us." The fear in his chest turned into something sharp. He ran down the hall, his heartbeat hammering in his ears. And then his world ended. His father was on the floor. His mother was on the bed, tied up, unmoving, strangled. It didn't even look like them. Charlie's eyes darted across the room, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. His father's head was wrapped in plastic, a belt twisted around his throat. His mother's face was frozen in pain, her body tied up in ropes that penetrated her skin. He didn't realize he was screaming until his throat burned. They ran, out the door, to the neighbor's house, the phone in his shaking hands, the words pouring out in gasps. "Something happened. They're not moving. We need help." The police came. He didn't know how long it took. Time didn't feel real anymore. He was outside when they entered the house, when they found Joey, his little brother, lifeless in another room. And then Josie. She wasn't there. Not in the bedroom, not in the hallway, not anywhere. Until they opened the basement door. Charlie didn't see her. The police wouldn't let him. But they told him later. Josephine, 11 years old, hanging from a pipe. They took him to the station. That's where they told him about Joey and Josie. He didn't remember what he said. He didn't remember if he said anything at all. "I thank God every day that I didn't find them," he would say later, "because I don't know how I would have handled it."
I thank God every day that I didn't find Joey and Josie, because I don't know how I would have handled it.
But even then, even in that moment, he knew. His family was gone, and someone had done this to them, normal, polite, and well-mannered. That's how people described Dennis Rader, a doting husband, a loving father, and an active member of his community. Rader was just another unassuming neighbor in Wichita, Kansas. He attended church, worked a stable job, and blended in seamlessly. But beneath this facade lurked a monster, a predator who thrived in the thrill of power, control, and death. He was the BTK killer: bind, torture, kill. Dennis Lynn Rader was born in 1945 in Pittsburgh, Kansas. He grew up in Wichita, where he presented himself as an ordinary boy. But behind the friendly exterior, dark urges simmered. As a child, Rader took pleasure in torturing and killing stray animals. He fantasized about power, control, and suffering. He later joined the Air Force, then married Paula Dietz in 1971. Together, they had 2 children. By all accounts, Rader was a normal family man. No one knew that, beneath the surface, he was harboring a desire to kill. That desire erupted in January 1974, when he chose his first victims, the Otero family. He had been watching them for weeks, noting Julie's routines, their home's vulnerabilities. Then, on the morning of January 15th, he made his move. Rader cut the phone lines and waited. Joey, the youngest, opened the back door to let the dog in, and Rader slipped inside. He held the Otero family at gunpoint, feeding them a fabricated story that he was a wanted man from California who only needed food and money. But his true intentions were far more ugly than his made-up story. He forced the family into a bedroom, binding each of them with the ropes he had brought. Joseph Otero Sr. fought back, but Rader overpowered him, securing his wrists and feet. Then, he placed a plastic bag over his head. When Joseph chewed a hole through it, Rader tightened another bag over him, watching as he slowly suffocated. Julie Otero's desperate plea came next. "Please save my son," she begged, referring to Joey. Rader removed the bag for a moment, but it was a cruel illusion of mercy. Moments later, he strangled her to death with a rope. Then came Joey. Rader placed a plastic bag over the 9-year-old's head, followed by 2 T-shirts and another bag. He watched as the child thrashed, gasping for air, until he finally went still. But the worst was yet to come. Josie Otero, 11 years old, had witnessed it all. Now Rader led her to the basement. He tied a noose to a pipe and slipped it around her neck. As he pulled the rope, Josie's feet barely touched the ground. "Mama, Mama," she cried. Her long hair got in his way as she struggled. And then she asked a question that still haunts those who hear it. "What will happen to me?" Rader's response was chilling. "Well, honey, you're going to be in heaven tonight with the rest of your family." He hanged her. He let her toes dangle just above the floor to prolong her suffering as he watched his achievement with utmost satisfaction on his face. Then, as her body went still, he desecrated the scene in the most depraved way imaginable. Dennis Rader evaded capture for 3 decades. When he was finally arrested in 2005, his confession revealed just how twisted his mind was.
This particular location, did you know these people?
No, that's no, that was part of my, I guess my what you call fantasy. These people were selected.
All right, so you
Okay.
you were engaged in some kind of fantasy during this period of time?
Yes, sir.
All right. Now, when you use the term fantasy, is this something you were doing for your personal pleasure?
Sexual fantasy, sir.
I see.
During his sentencing, prosecutors presented disturbing evidence: crime scene photos, drawings, trophies he collected from victims, a macabre stash of keepsakes. Rader himself provided a recounting of his crimes very casually, sending chills down the spine of everyone watching, speaking as though he were discussing a hobby.
All right, when you went into the house, what happened then?
Well, I confronted the family, pulled a pistol, confronted Mr. Otero, and asked him to, that I was there to, basically, I was wanted to get the car. I was hungry, food, I was wanted, and asked him to lie down in the living room. And at that time, I realized that wouldn't be a really good idea, so I finally, the dog was a real problem, so I asked Mr. Otero if he could get the dog out, so he had one of the kids put it out. And then I took him back to the bedroom.
You took who back to the bedroom?
The family, to the bedroom, the 4 members.
All right, what happened then?
At that time, I tied him up.
While still holding him at gunpoint?
Well, in between tying and yes. Yeah. Well, after that, I did Mrs. Otero. I had never strangled anyone before, so I really didn't know how much pressure you had to put on a person or how long it would take. But
was she also tied up there in the
yes,
bedroom?
yeah, both her hands and their feet were tied up. She was on the bed.
Where were the children?
Josephine was on the bed and Junior was on the floor at this time. Basically, when Mr. Otero was down, Mrs. Otero was down, I went ahead and took Junior, I put it in the bag over his head and took him to the other bedroom at that time.
What did you do then?
Put a bag over his head, I put a cloth over his head, a T-shirt and a bag so he couldn't tear a hole in it. And he subsequently died from that. And then when I went back, Josephine had woke back up.
What did you do then?
And I took her to the basement and eventually hung her.
All right, you hung her in the basement?
Yes, sir.
All right, did you do anything else at that time?
Yes, I had some sexual fantasies. But that was...
He recalled how he made sure Josie's toes barely touched the ground so she wouldn't die too quickly, how he trained his hands with a squeeze ball to strengthen his grip for strangulation, how he broke into homes disguised as a phone repairman, how he mocked his victims' last words, mimicking their desperate pleas as yada, yada, yada. In a particularly harrowing moment, Rader admitted that he kept meticulous notes on his victims, listing their roles in his sick fantasies. Josie, he wrote, was my star young maiden that I will teach sex to. The courtroom was silent, except for the sobs of the victims' families. Charlie Otero, now an adult, broke down when he saw a photo of his sister Josie hanging lifeless in the basement, where he had once played as a child. He buried his face in his hands, unable to bear the sight. Rader was sentenced to 10 consecutive life terms, no parole, no escape, just a cell where he would rot for the rest of his miserable life. But for the families of his victims, there was no true closure.
I'm Carmen Julie Otero Montoya. Although we have never met, you have seen my face before. It is the same face you murdered over 30 years ago, the face of my mother, Julie Otero. I will not address you as Mr. Rader because Mr. is a word of respect, as in Mr. Can you help me, not Mr. Are you going to kill me? BTK is how you want to be known, and I will not give you that satisfaction. Rader is an appropriate name for you, as in one who invades a surprise attack. That is nothing to be proud of. Rader, when you took away my mother, you took someone who meant a lot to a lot of people. My mother loved life, her friends, a good laugh, dancing with my dad, and she loved to help people. But most of all, she loved and lived for us, her family. She showed me how to love, to be a good person, to accept others as they are, and most of all, to face your fears. I'm sure you saw that in her face as she fought to live. My mother against your gun, you're such a coward.
As one victim's son put it, what do you expect from a demon? The Otero family were not his only victims. On April 4, 1974, just months after the Otero family murders, Rader struck again. Catherine Bright, a 21-year-old woman living in Wichita, had no idea that a predator was stalking her. Rader had selected her, watched her, learned her routines. When she left her home that day, he made his move, breaking in through the screen door. But things didn't go according to plan. He hadn't expected her 19-year-old brother Kevin Bright to be there. Rader pulled out his gun and forced Kevin to restrain his sister, handing him a rope he had brought for this very purpose. Then he took Catherine into another room. She fought him, struggling so much that his usual method of strangulation proved ineffective. Frustrated, he grabbed a knife and stabbed her 3 times in the back and lower abdomen. She bled out, her body giving one final shudder before going still.
If I had brought my stuff and used my stuff, Kevin would probably be dead today.
All right.
I'm not bragging on that. It's just a matter of fact. It's the bonds I tied him up with that he broke them. So, and that,
All right.
and maybe same with Catherine. It got out of hand.
Meanwhile, Rader attempted to kill Kevin by strangling him and then shooting him in the head. But Kevin refused to die. Clinging to life, he played dead until Rader left. Then, using every ounce of his remaining strength, he managed to escape, running for his life. Unlike the Oteros, Kevin Bright survived. He lived to tell the tale of the man who called himself BTK. But Dennis Rader wasn't finished yet, not even close. On March 17, 1977, Shirley Ruth Relford, who was 25 at the time, was found dead in her Wichita home, the victim of Dennis Rader's twisted fantasies. Rader had stalked her, following her 5-year-old son home to discover their residence. Once inside, he brandished a handgun, the weight of his presence sucking the air from the room. Fear was instant, suffocating. He confined her 3 children, tying them up and locking them in the bathroom. Their muffled cries and frantic pounding on the door did nothing to dissuade him. With precision and what seemed like a lot of practice, he led Relford to the bedroom where sheer terror overwhelmed her, so much so that she vomited. But he didn't care. He bound her legs to the bedpost, restraining her with the cold efficiency of a man who had done this before. Then came the plastic bag, stretched tight over her face, followed by the rope. As he pulled, her body writhed, twisting against the bed, her choked sobs mixing with the muffled screams of her children just down the hall. They begged for their mother, but the monster inside Dennis would not listen to the cries and begs for mercy. He had already decided their fate. He was going to kill them too. But fate intervened. The children managed to escape before he could carry out the rest of his plan, leaving Rader with only their mother's lifeless body as his trophy. And just like that, he disappeared into the night, slipping back into the mundane world where no one suspected a thing. He was still just Dennis Rader, the polite neighbor, the churchgoer, the family man. But behind closed doors, BTK lurked, waiting for his next victim. Nancy Jo Fox, who was also 25 at the time, was Dennis Rader's next prey. He had been watching her for weeks, following her routine, learning her patterns. She lived alone, an ideal target. On the night of December 8, 1977, Rader approached her home, anticipation burning in his veins. He cut the phone lines before slipping inside, a trick he used for almost every victim. Then he hid in the shadows of her kitchen, waiting. When Nancy finally walked through the door, she had no idea the nightmare lurking within. She barely had time to react before he pounced. With a gun in hand, he forced her into submission, his voice eerily calm as he ordered her to undress. Fear flickered in her eyes, but she obeyed. He bound her wrists and ankles, savoring the control. As she lay helpless on her bed, Dennis tightened a belt around her neck. He squeezed slowly, prolonging her agony. She struggled, gasped, but her fate had been sealed the moment she walked through that door. On February 10, 1978, Rader sent a letter to Wichita television station KAKE claiming responsibility for the murders. He suggested many possible names for himself, including BTK. He demanded media attention in this second letter, saying, "How many do I have to kill before I get a name in the paper or some national attention?" A poem was enclosed titled, "Oh, Death to Nancy," a parody of the lyrics to the American folk song called "Oh, Death." In the letter, Rader claimed to be driven to kill by what he called Factor X, which he characterized as a supernatural element that also motivated Jack the Ripper, the son of Sam, and the Hillside Stranglers. He also asked for the police to send him a hidden message. In response, and with the knowledge that the BTK killer watched Cake, police decided to flash a subliminal message during one of the station's evening newscasts for a split second. The message stated, "Now call the chief," and featured a drawing of an upside-down pair of glasses, which were found at the Fox crime scene. They hoped the message would influence the killer to turn himself in, but it was unsuccessful. In 1979, Dennis set his sights on Anna Williams, a 63-year-old woman he had become obsessed with. He waited for hours inside her home, growing more impatient by the minute. When she didn't return home in time, he was livid, his perfect plan ruined. Anna Williams unknowingly escaped death that night. His later murders grew more refined, more deliberate. 53-year-old Maureen Hedge was kidnapped from her home in 1985. Dennis Rader took her lifeless body to the church where he was a council president, posed her corpse in twisted positions, photographed her, then dumped her in a ditch. 28-year-old Vicki Wegerle had to go through a similar horror. She was strangled in 1986, lured into a false sense of security by Dennis posing as a telephone repairman. And Dolores Davis, age 62, his final known victim, was murdered in 1991, strangled with pantyhose before being dumped under a bridge. By 2004, the BTK case had gone cold. Police had no leads, no new evidence, until Dennis, unable to resist the need for attention, reignited the game himself. Between March 2004 and February 2005, he sent 11 cryptic messages to local media, taunting law enforcement and reliving the times he had made his victims suffer. In March 2004, the Wichita Eagle received a letter from a supposed Bill Thomas Killman, confessing to the murder of Vicki Wegerle in the year 1986. Enclosed were photographs of the crime scene and a copy of Wegerle's stolen driver's license. DNA testing of evidence from Wegerle's fingernails confirmed the BTK killer was responsible. Police began collecting DNA from hundreds of men, but no match was found. Rader continued his sick game, leaving packages at random locations. One contained a bound doll with a plastic bag over its head, mimicking Nancy Fox's murder. In one letter, he wrote, "They know nothing at all. I did it by myself, and with no one's help, I can't stop it, so the monster goes on. Good luck hunting." At the end of the letter, he suggested his own moniker by signing off, "Bind them, torture them, kill them. BTK." Another held a poem threatening lead investigator Lieutenant Ken Landwehr. In January 2005, he left a cereal box in a Home Depot parking lot, hoping it would be found. When it wasn't, he asked about it in his next message. This led police to review surveillance footage, spotting a man driving a black Jeep Cherokee, the same vehicle registered to Rader. But the final mistake? His own arrogance. In February 2005, Rader asked police if a floppy disk could be traced. They responded via a newspaper ad. It would be safe. Taking the bait, Rader sent a purple floppy disk to a news station. Within minutes, police extracted metadata revealing it had last been edited by Dennis at Christ Lutheran Church. A quick search led them to Dennis Rader, who was the president of the church council. His Jeep sat outside his house, confirming what police already suspected. A warrant was issued, but they needed DNA proof. They obtained a PAP smear from Rader's daughter at a Kansas State University clinic. The results confirmed a familial match to the BTK evidence. With this, Dennis Rader was finally arrested. When officers approached him, one asked, "Mr. Rader, do you know why you're going downtown?" Without missing a beat, Dennis Rader replied, "Oh, I have suspicions why." Law enforcement searched his home, office, and church, seizing computer equipment, black pantyhose, and a cylindrical container. The next morning, Wichita Police Chief Norman Williams stepped before the cameras and declared, "The bottom line, BTK is arrested." After his guilty plea, Rader underwent a psychological evaluation by Dr. Robert Mendoza, a forensic psychologist. Mendoza diagnosed him with narcissistic, obsessive-compulsive, and antisocial personality disorders. Rader exhibited a grandiose sense of self, an obsession with structure and order, a deep need for admiration, and a total lack of empathy. Rader's delusions of superiority made him believe he was special, above the law, a mastermind who had successfully fooled the world. He craved control, not just over his victims, but also in the courtroom, where he narrated his crimes in gruesome detail without a hint of remorse. His interview with Mendoza, intended for court use, was later broadcasted on NBC's Dateline, igniting controversy. The Kansas Attorney General sued Mendoza and his firm for breaching confidentiality, eventually settling the case for $30,000. The evaluation confirmed what the world already knew. Dennis Rader was a remorseless predator, incapable of understanding the emotional devastation he caused. On February 28, 2005, Dennis Rader was charged with 10 counts of first-degree murder. Initially, he entered a not guilty plea, but on June 27, 2005, he changed it to guilty, detailing each murder so proudly, like an achievement that must be appreciated by the world. At his sentencing on August 18th, he delivered a rambling 30-minute apology, which he described as an Academy Awards acceptance speech. He was sentenced to 10 consecutive life sentences, with a minimum of 175 years. Kansas did not enforce the death penalty at the time. On his way to El Dorado Correctional Facility, he spoke casually with officers about the weather, but began to cry when victim impact statements played on the radio. Now locked away in solitary confinement, he spends his days in a small cell with minimal privileges, a fate far kinder than what he inflicted upon his victims. Dennis Rader's gruesome fantasies and inexplicable crimes has inspired countless works of fiction and true crime adaptations. Stephen King admitted that his novella called A Good Marriage, later turned into a film, was based on Rader's double life. Thomas Harris took inspiration from BTK for the character Francis Dollarhide in Red Dragon. The case has been dissected in episodes of Law & Order SVU, Criminal Minds, and Netflix's Catching Killers and Mindhunter. Even music has explored his crimes, with thrash metal band Exodus writing BTK for their album Blood In, Blood Out, and Steven Wilson's haunting track Rader 2 were all inspired by the monster's ill desires and the actions he took to gratify them. But Dennis Rader's crimes do not stop here. In August 2023, authorities discovered a possibility that no one wanted to believe in. Dennis Rader may have had more victims. Investigators discovered quote-unquote possible trophies from additional unsolved cases while searching his former Park City home. The revelations led them to revisit long cold disappearances, including that of Cynthia Dawn Kinney.
He confessed to 10 murders almost 2 decades ago. He was known as BTK, a name he gave himself, short for Bind, Torture, Kill. He is currently serving life sentences at a maximum security facility in Kansas. And now there is new evidence that may connect the infamous BTK serial killer to additional murders. Arjun Casares spoke to the killer's daughter and got exclusive access to some of his diary entries and drawings.
Shortly after Kenny's disappearance, the sheriff's office received an anonymous call.
That male caller informed them that she was located in an old barn.
No evidence that lead was ever looked into. Her body was never found. But authorities are now looking at this journal entry by Rader. Bad Wash Day.
He marked that in 1976, he had murdered someone from a laundromat.
For the first time, law enforcement is revealing detailed drawings made by Rader, showing young girls tied and bound in barns.
Cynthia, just 16 years old, was last seen on June 23, 1976, at Osage Laundromat in Oklahoma. Witnesses recalled a faded beige 1965 Plymouth Belvedere pulling up before she vanished. Decades later, Sheriff Eddie Verdon connected Rader to the crime after finding an eerie entry in his writings: "Bad wash day." It was a seemingly innocuous phrase until authorities realized that an ADT alarm system had been installed at a bank across from the laundromat the day Cynthia disappeared. Dennis Rader had been in the area working as an installer. More disturbingly, Dennis had allegedly confessed in his writings to fantasizing about kidnapping a girl from a laundromat. Despite mounting circumstantial evidence, Dennis denied involvement, possibly fearing the death penalty in Oklahoma. The question remains, how many more victims of his nauseating fantasies are still waiting to be discovered? If you like the way we create these videos and you want to help,
they were literally slaughtered, and I think, who could do that to little children?
It was so intentional. They slaughtered them.
they say no crime is more unforgivable than taking a child's life. And in this case, that horror became the driving force behind a decades-long investigation in Phoenix, Arizona. On Labor Day, 1982, a father lost his daughter to an epileptic seizure, a tragedy no parent should ever face. But when he returned home, hoping to grieve in peace, he walked into something far worse. His wife and her 2 children had been brutally murdered. One loss was already unbearable, but this was a nightmare beyond imagination. Detectives scrambled for answers, chasing leads that led nowhere, desperately searching for a motive. But as the years passed, the case went cold. Now, more than 42 years later, 2 chilling questions remain. Who slaughtered Valerie and her little girls? And why? When people hear about an unsolved murder from more than 40 years ago, it's easy to assume the case is lost to time. But time doesn't erase the pain, and it certainly doesn't erase the truth. With today's advancements in forensic technology and the power of public attention, we've seen cold cases cracked wide open, revealing shocking answers after decades of silence. The brutal stabbing of a young mother and her 2 little girls is one of those cases, a tragedy that still lingers in the shadows, waiting for justice. Someone out there knows what happened that night, and after all these years, the Pride family still deserves answers. But before Valerie's name was tied to one of Phoenix's most haunting murder cases, she was a young woman with big dreams and an unstoppable drive. Born on March 9, 1958, she grew up in Arizona with 5 brothers and 1 sister, shaping her into a strong and determined person. She attended South Mountain High School, where she was known for her intelligence and ambition. After graduating, she set her sights on Arizona State University, determined to build a better future for herself. But Valerie wasn't just a student, she was also in love. In high school, she started dating a young man named Jimmy Pride. Their relationship blossomed, and in 1974, they got married. Just 1 year later, they welcomed their first daughter, Shantia. Then in 1977, their family grew again when Valerie gave birth to their second daughter, Dwana. Even as a young mother, Valerie refused to let go of her ambitions. She had dreams of becoming an electrician, an industry dominated by men at the time, and she wasn't about to let anything stand in her way. Around the time Dwana was born, she landed an apprenticeship co-sponsored by the Electrical Workers Union, a rare and competitive opportunity. But Valerie didn't just enter the field, she made history. She became the first black female electrician to work at the Palo Verde nuclear plant, breaking barriers while raising 2 small children. As you can see, her life was a balancing act, juggling motherhood, work, and the pressures of being a pioneer in her field. But despite her accomplishments, Valerie's personal life wasn't without struggles. She and Jimmy's marriage eventually came to an end, leading to a divorce. Still, She remained focused on her career and her children, determined to provide them with the best life possible. After her divorce, Valerie found love again with a man named Ben Daniels, a co-worker at the nuclear plant. He also had children from a previous relationship, and as their bond deepened, they began planning a future together. But beneath the surface, their relationship wasn't as perfect as it seemed. Valerie's sister Vicky later shared in an interview with ABC5 in Phoenix that there were things in Ben's past that cast a shadow over his relationship with Valerie. She didn't go into detail, but she did say that Ben would often reassure Valerie that he had everything under control. Whatever those issues were, they didn't seem to stop Valerie from moving forward with their relationship. She trusted him. She believed in their future. And soon they were taking a major step together. In 1982, Valerie and Ben decided to buy a house, an exciting milestone for any couple. They settled on a newly built Spanish-style home in the South Mountain area of Phoenix, a place where they hoped to build a fresh start. At the same time, Valerie was entering the final year of her electrician apprenticeship. She was on the verge of a breakthrough. Her career was taking off. She had found love again after her divorce, and now she had a new home where she and her daughters could create new memories. Everything seemed to be falling into place. But sometimes, the most promising moments in life can be shattered in an instant. Just weeks after moving into their new home, tragedy struck in the most unexpected way. Labor Day weekend of 1982 started like any other holiday for Valerie and her daughters. It was meant to be a day of rest, family time, and simple joys. But by Monday, September 6th, what began as a normal day took a devastating turn. Around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Ben received a phone call that no parent ever wants to get. His 9-year-old daughter from a previous relationship had suffered an epileptic seizure while taking a bath. According to reports, the child's mother had been supervising her but briefly stepped away. In those few moments, the little girl had a seizure and slipped beneath the water. She was rushed to the hospital where doctors fought to save her. But by the time Ben arrived, it was too late. His daughter had been pronounced dead. While Ben was at the hospital, grappling with this unimaginable loss, Valerie and her daughters remained at home, completely unaware of what had just happened. In an era before cell phones, there was no quick way for Valerie to reach Ben, no way to check in or ask what was happening. She could only wait for him to call. Now, what exactly transpired in the Pride home during those next few hours remains a mystery. But what we do know is that at around 9:30 that evening, Valerie spoke on the phone with Ben's brother. That call would be the last known contact she ever had with anyone outside of her home. Over the years, reports have varied about who exactly Valerie was speaking to on the phone that night. Some sources claimed it was a friend, while others believed she was talking to her brother. However, in a more recent interview, Valerie's sister, Vicky, clarified that she was actually on the phone with Ben's brother. According to him, their conversation lasted about 10 minutes. It's likely that he was updating Valerie on what was happening at the hospital with Ben's daughter, but then something interrupted their call. Someone knocked on Valerie's front door. She told Ben's brother that she had to hang up to answer it, since Ben wasn't home, and that was the last time anyone heard from her. Neither Valerie nor Ben's brother could have known that this would be the final conversation she would ever have. At around 10 p.m., after spending hours at the hospital, Ben finally returned home, emotionally drained, devastated by the loss of his daughter, and likely just wanting to rest. But as he approached his house, something felt off. The front door was slightly open. That wasn't normal, especially not in the Arizona summer heat, when people kept their doors shut to keep the cool air inside. Cautiously, Ben pushed the door open and stepped inside, and what he found was beyond his worst nightmares. Blood, everywhere.
On a quiet street in South Phoenix, Valerie Pride and her 2 daughters, Shonita and Duana, were murdered.
And they were brutally, repeatedly stabbed inside their living room in very close proximity.
His 2 stepdaughters, 8-year-old Shantia and 4-year-old Duana, lay lifeless in the living room, their small bodies covered in blood. They had been brutally murdered. Just a few feet away, near the kitchen, Valerie was also dead, her body drenched in blood. The home they had just moved into, the place where they had hoped to build a new life, had become the scene of an unspeakable massacre. Ben's screams pierced the night. Overcome with horror, he collapsed, wailing so loudly that neighbors rushed outside, trying to understand what was happening. It was they who called the police, as Ben was too inconsolable to do anything but grieve. For any parent, losing a child is a pain that words cannot describe. But to lose a child and then return home to find your entire family slaughtered, it was unfathomable. When the police arrived, even seasoned officers struggled to process what they were seeing. Many described it as the most horrifying crime scene they had ever encountered. Blood covered the floors, the walls. It was everywhere. One detective, speaking to the Arizona Republic, described it simply, "My God, it's terrible in there. There are stabbings everywhere." Stabbings are already some of the most violent types of murders, but when children are involved, the horror is magnified. The 2 little girls were found huddled together in the living room near a love seat. They were still in their pajamas, meaning they had likely been preparing for bed when the attack happened. Valerie, on the other hand, was found in the dining area, close to the kitchen. Her body was just feet away from the back door, as if she had been trying to escape. All 3 victims had been stabbed multiple times. Reports later revealed that one of the girls had been brutally mutilated. Strangely, there were no signs of forced entry. This meant that the killer had either been invited in or had somehow entered without breaking in. It wasn't until police learned about the knock on the door during Valerie's last phone call that they began piecing together a chilling possibility. Whoever had knocked that night may have been the person responsible for this unimaginable crime. And just as disturbingly, the murderer hadn't lingered in the house. Investigators determined that after the killings, the suspect had escaped through the back door and jumped over the fence, disappearing into the night. Now, the killings were initially thought to be a robbery gone wrong, but that theory was quickly shattered. There was no sign of forced entry, no stolen belongings, nothing to suggest a break-in. Instead, what lay before them was a scene of unimaginable carnage. Someone had entered that house with one purpose, and that is to kill. But who would want to murder a young mother and her little girls in such a savage manner? That was the question burning in the minds of investigators, and they knew time was not on their side. A killer was out there, and they had to find them before they struck again. That night, the neighborhood was silent, but someone had heard something. As police canvassed the area, one neighbor admitted to catching the sound of a heated argument coming from the Pride home around 9:45. But they had dismissed it as just another family dispute. When they peeked outside, they saw nothing, no stranger lurking, no commotion, nothing that screamed danger. And then, an hour later, at around 11, Valerie's ex-husband, Jimmy Pride, arrived at the house. When officers broke the news that his daughters had been murdered, he collapsed on the pavement, his anguish screams ripping through the night just like Ben's. He was inconsolable, thrashing, sobbing uncontrollably. The pain was unbearable, and officers had to physically restrain him as he broke down. Now, as mentioned earlier, behind the house on the wooden fence was a bloody handprint. It was undeniable proof that the murderer had escaped by scaling the fence, vanishing into the darkness, slipping through the yard of an abandoned home nearby. But whose handprint was it? And what kind of monster was capable of such a savage act? The investigation took an even darker turn when detectives realized the Pride family had only recently moved into the neighborhood. They had been there for just a few weeks, barely long enough to make friends, let alone enemies. No one truly knew them, and yet someone had wanted them dead. Desperate for answers, detectives shifted their focus to Valerie's life, digging into her social circles, family ties, and any hint of an enemy in the shadows. But the deeper they searched, the more unsettling the truth became, because there was nothing. Valerie had no history of conflicts, no bitter feuds, no past that suggested a violent end. She was a devoted mother, living an ordinary life. And yet, someone had shattered that life in the most gruesome way possible. Then came the autopsy results, confirming that all 3 victims had been stabbed multiple times. The attack was frenzied, brutal, but there was one detail that stood out. None of them had been sexually assaulted. That ruled out one possible motive, but it didn't bring them any closer to the truth. With every passing day, the case grew colder, the unanswered questions piling up, and naturally, the town was gripped by fear. On September 10, 1982, Valerie and her daughters were laid to rest, but their funerals were anything but peaceful. A dark cloud hung over the community, a terrifying realization that a killer was still out there, walking free. Then, detectives uncovered a bizarre lead. A month before the murders, Valerie and her husband Ben's home had been broken into. At first, it seemed like a standard burglary, but the details were anything but normal. The intruder hadn't just ransacked the house, they had slashed the waterbed in the couple's room. Even more disturbingly, they had taken Valerie's clothes and dumped them into the water. It was personal. This wasn't a thief looking for valuables. This was someone with a grudge, someone who wanted to send a message. Could this have been a warning? Had Valerie unknowingly crossed paths with someone dangerous? Investigators desperately tried to connect the dots, but once again, the case hit a dead end. Whoever had done it had vanished without a trace. As months passed, promising leads turned to dust. Hundreds of tips poured in, each offering the hope of a breakthrough, but none led detectives any closer to the truth. The case, once burning with urgency, began to grow cold, and as it did, the rumors started. Whispers spread through the town, theories emerging like shadows in the night. But one stood out among the rest, a chilling suggestion that the murders might be connected to the tragic death of Ben's daughter. Some believed Valerie and her daughters had been killed as part of a twisted act of revenge. Ben's 9-year-old daughter had died under tragic circumstances, and some speculated that someone blamed Valerie. But when investigators revisited the case, the truth was clear. The child had suffered an epileptic seizure and drowned. The autopsy confirmed it. There was no evidence of foul play, no reason to believe her death had been anything more than a devastating accident. But still, the rumors persisted, feeding the town's paranoia. As the 1-year anniversary of the murders approached, detectives found themselves no closer to solving the case than when they had first begun. The brutal slaying of Valerie and her daughters had shaken the whole town to its core, yet despite relentless efforts, investigators were still chasing shadows. A reward of $2,000 was being offered by the union Valerie worked for, along with the silent witness program, but not a single lead had brought them closer to the truth. Then, in August of 1983, the case took a shocking turn. Police announced an arrest. This news sent a ripple through the town, raising hopes that justice was finally within reach. But what stunned everyone even more was the suspect, a 14-year-old high school student. Detectives also revealed that they were also searching for 2 additional suspects, another juvenile and an adult, whom they believed had played a role in the murders. The Arizona Republic newspaper reported that police suspected the killings were an act of revenge for the death of Ben's daughter, a theory that had once been whispered about but never confirmed. The arrested teenager was allegedly a relative of the little girl who had died. Could someone have blamed Valerie for the child's death? Had resentment festered into something dark and violent? The very thought was horrifying, but the theory itself raised more questions than answers. If Ben's daughter's death had been ruled an accident, why would someone hold Valerie responsible? And if revenge was truly the motive, why murder her daughters as well? It didn't make sense. Even the investigators had their doubts. But just as quickly as it seemed they had found a motive, the case fell apart. Within 24 hours of the arrest, the 14-year-old was released. The district attorney refused to press charges, stating that more investigation was needed. Whatever evidence detectives had, it wasn't strong enough to hold up in court. The other two potential suspects? Never arrested, no charges, no answers. And just like that, the case that had briefly flickered back to life went cold once again. 2 years after this, a neighbor made a startling discovery: a knife buried in a backyard. It was eerily similar in size and shape to the one believed to have been used in the murders. Investigators wasted no time sending it to the crime lab, hoping this could finally be the break they needed. Maybe, after all this time, they had found the murder weapon. But once again, hope turned to heartbreak. The knife was tested for DNA, but there was nothing, no trace of Valerie, Shantia, or Dwana. Another dead end, another roadblock in a case that seemed destined to remain a mystery. As the years stretched into decades, detectives refused to let the case go cold. They combed through every shred of evidence, spoke to more than 1,000 people, and chased down every lead, yet they still couldn't pinpoint the killer or their motive. By 2012, investigators admitted they had exhausted every avenue. They needed the public's help. Someone out there had to know something. They remained convinced that this was a deeply personal crime, that whoever had done this had entered the Pride family's home just to murder them. And now, more than 4 decades have passed since that horrific night. The mystery remains unsolved. The brutal murder of Valerie, Shantia, and Dwana still lingers like a ghost over the community, an open wound that refuses to heal. Investigators believe that someone close to Valerie holds the key to unlocking the truth. But how could a person capable of such savagery go on living as if nothing had happened? Did they feel guilt? Did they ever fear getting caught? Or had they convinced themselves they had gotten away with murder? In recent years, with advancements in forensic technology, detectives have begun re-examining evidence. DNA found at the crime scene has been submitted into the national database, raising the possibility that a breakthrough may still come. But even if the killer is eventually unmasked, no explanation will ever make sense. There is no justification for the slaughter of an innocent mother and her 2 young daughters. This crime was the very definition of senseless. Valerie, Shantia, and Dwana did not deserve what happened to them. And no matter how much time has passed, one thing remains certain: anyone who could commit such an unspeakable act deserves to be brought to justice. Now, I want to hear your 2 cents on this. Do you truly believe this could have been an act of revenge? If it really was a relative of Ben's child, why would they go out of their way to commit murder instead of mourning on the very same day the daughter passed away? Drop your thoughts in the comments below.
This was the last the world saw of Raymond Ratima, jailed for life for killing 7 people.
This man was convicted of slaughtering 7 people, including his own children. And as you can see, he still had the audacity to blow a kiss at the camera as if nothing had happened. That eerie moment alone cements him as one of the most cold-blooded mass murderers in New Zealand's history. And the name starts with Raymond Wayne Ratima, a man whose actions shook the peaceful town of Masterton, a place where people believed they were safe, where families built their lives, and where crime on such a horrific scale was nearly unthinkable. But in June of the year 1992, that belief was shattered forever. Masterton, at that time, was a relatively small and tight-knit community known for its rural charm and quiet suburban life. Located in the Wairarapa region, the town was surrounded by lush green farmland, rolling hills, and a landscape that painted a picture of serenity. The economy was primarily driven by agriculture, with sheep farming being one of the dominant industries. Many of the town's residents either worked in farming or in supporting industries such as wool processing, small-scale manufacturing, and retail. The pace of life was slow and predictable, and violent crime was a rarity. However, beneath this picturesque surface, economic struggles were beginning to take root. The early 90s saw New Zealand grappling with the effects of economic reforms from the previous decade. Many families, particularly those in working-class communities like Masterton, were feeling the pressure of rising unemployment and financial instability. Jobs were scarce, wages were low, and welfare support was often inadequate. For someone like Ratima, who was already struggling to provide for his family, these factors only added to his growing frustration and desperation. Now, while there's not much known about the early life of Ratima, or even how he met his wife, what we do know is that by the beginning of that fateful year, his life had begun to spiral downward. At the age of 25, Ratima and his wife Tony were struggling to keep their heads above water. Financial hardship weighed them down, making it impossible for them to keep up with the rising rent. With 3 young children to care for, they were forced to move into Tony's parents' home on Judd Street, Masterton. Living under the same roof as extended family members wasn't easy. The house was crowded, tensions were high, and Ratima's relationship with Tony was crumbling under the pressure. Arguments became more frequent, emotions ran high, and resentment festered. It was in this suffocating environment that the seeds of rage were planted. As the months dragged on, Ratima's anger only grew. It wasn't just the financial struggles, though they played a significant role. It was the feeling of being powerless, of being unwanted, of watching his world crumble before his eyes. He reached out for help. He sought assistance from social services, hoping for some relief, some way to get back on his feet. But the help he needed never came. He was left to stew in his despair, and that despair quickly turned into a murderous rage. By June, Ratima's marriage had completely fallen apart. A serious altercation between him, his wife, and her family was the final breaking point. He was thrown out of the house, rejected, cast aside. With nowhere to go and no support, his mind began to unravel. Days of little sleep, wandering with nothing but his anger and hopelessness for company, led him to one horrifying conclusion. If he couldn't have his family, no one would. On the night of June 26, 1992, Tony left the house to meet her parents, Philip and Rebecca Ferguson, at a local pub. She left behind her 3 young sons, Pierre, Barney, and Stacy, under the care of her sister Nicola. Also in the house that night were Tony's brother Philip, Nicola's de facto partner Bevan Tepu, and their young son Stephen. It was at precisely 9:25 in the evening when Raymond Ratima stormed back into the house, armed with a knife and a softball bat. The brutal attack that followed was nothing short of a massacre. He slaughtered everyone inside. He bludgeoned and stabbed 7 people to death, showing no mercy. Even his own children, his flesh and blood, were not spared. In a chilling act, he placed their lifeless bodies on his wife's bed and laid a Bible on top of them, as if it were some twisted attempt at absolution. The adults were no luckier. He piled their bodies on top of one another in another bedroom, stacking them like objects in a scene too gruesome to comprehend. But Ratima's bloodlust was not yet satisfied. He sat in the house, waiting for Tony and her parents to return so he could finish what he had started. When they finally walked through the door, the nightmare continued. Nicola's father, Philip, was the first to be attacked. Ratima swung the softball bat with full force, striking him in a brutal assault. But this time, things did not go according to plan. In the chaos, Tony managed to escape, running for her life to call for help. When the police arrived, the carnage they witnessed would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Blood soaked the floors, lifeless bodies filled the rooms, and in the midst of it all was Raymond Ratima, subdued, restrained, and no longer in control. Nicola's father, Philip, had overpowered him. preventing an even greater tragedy. The news of the massacre spread like wildfire. New Zealand had never seen such a horrifying crime. A father, a husband, a son-in-law, someone who was supposed to protect his family, had instead wiped them out in cold blood. The community of Masterton was left reeling, struggling to understand how something so monstrous could have happened in their quiet town. Ratima was arrested on the scene and taken into custody. His initial demeanor was eerily calm, as if he had accepted his fate. He offered little resistance, making no attempt to flee. During questioning, he showed minimal emotion, providing cold, matter-of-fact responses. Investigators were disturbed by his apparent lack of remorse. When Ratima stood trial, the nation watched in shock. He expressed remorse, but the sheer brutality of his crimes left many wondering if it was genuine or merely an attempt to save himself from the harshest punishment. During the trial, the prosecution painted a picture of a man who had allowed his rage and feelings of inadequacy to fester for too long. The defense, on the other hand, argued that Ratima had been pushed to his breaking point due to financial strain and rejection by his wife's family. Mental health professionals were brought in to assess his state of mind, but ultimately, the jury saw through any justifications. The judge described the killings as unimaginable and beyond comprehension. He was sentenced to life imprisonment for 7 counts of murder. Additionally, he was given 10 years for the killing of an unborn child and another 7 years for attempted murder. But even behind bars, the horror of what he had done did not fade. The parole board repeatedly denied his bids for release, citing his continued struggles with drug abuse. In 2008, the board noted that despite presenting himself as a reformed man in previous hearings, Ratima had relapsed into cannabis use, blaming his actions on a dark day in his past. But if you think he had given up, think again. Year after year, Raymond Wayne Ratima has stood before the parole board, pleading for his release. He insists that he has changed, that he has grown, that he is no longer the man he was when he committed those horrific crimes in June of the year 1992. Yet, each time, the board has denied his requests, stating the same concerns: his psychological state, his risk to society, and his lack of true remorse. It has now been more than 30 years since Ratima was sentenced, and despite numerous parole hearings, the board remains unconvinced that he is fit to re-enter the world outside prison walls. Ratima has been denied parole not just once or twice, but a total of 14 times. His repeated attempts to gain freedom have been met with the same result, and each rejection only adds to his frustration. His lawyer, Roger Eagles, has now taken a different approach, claiming that there is potential bias in the parole process. Eagles argues that one of the parole board members, Professor Philip Brinded, had previously prepared psychological reports on Ratima in the year 1992, and his involvement in the current parole decisions could create an unfair assessment. Eagles insists that Brinded's prior contact with Ratima, spanning back to the time of his original sentencing, raises questions about impartiality. He points out that Brinded is the only person on the board who has had extensive personal interaction with Ratima, and this could lead to preconceived judgments rather than an objective evaluation of Ratima's progress over the past 3 decades. The legal challenge does not stop there. Eagles has also argued that Ratima's repeated parole denials themselves are evidence of bias. He claims that despite Ratima undergoing rehabilitation programs and counseling, the board has never granted him even a single opportunity for conditional release, raising concerns about whether he is being treated unfairly compared to other prisoners with similar convictions. However, the parole board has maintained its stance, insisting that every hearing is based on up-to-date psychological evaluations and risk assessments rather than relying on reports from the past. They argue that Ratima's continued imprisonment is not the result of bias, but rather the outcome of his failure to meet the necessary criteria for release. Justice Lisa Preston, who is currently reviewing the case, has questioned why Ratima himself did not object to Brinded's presence on the board. Eagles responded by saying that it was not Ratima's responsibility to point out the issue, as he lacks the legal expertise and education to fully understand the implications of Brinded's involvement. Eagles further stated that Ratima has significant academic difficulties due to his background, and that it should have been the responsibility of the chairperson to raise the matter. He insists that the failure to do so places an unfair burden on Ratima and undermines the fairness of the parole process. Another point of contention in Ratima's case is the way his parole hearings have been conducted. Eagles has argued that previous hearings have gone off track, with the board focusing too much on questioning Ratima about his motivations for the crimes and the impact on his victims. He claims that the discussions have shifted from evaluating whether Ratima is fit for release to revisiting his past, which should not be the central focus of the hearings. Eagles contends that while it is understandable for the board to consider the severity of Ratima's crimes, parole decisions should be based on his rehabilitation and risk factors in the present rather than continuously re-examining the past. In the year 2021, it was revealed that Ratima had begun a relationship with a woman who had suffered childhood trauma. The board expressed concerns about this relationship, fearing that it could be a trigger for another violent episode. Given Ratima's history and the emotional volatility that played a role in his past actions, the board was deeply troubled by this revelation. They questioned whether Ratima was capable of forming healthy relationships, or if this new connection was a sign of unresolved psychological issues. Despite attending nearly 100 sessions with a psychologist, board members still believed Ratima lacked insight into his crimes, which made them skeptical of his ability to maintain a stable and responsible relationship outside of prison. The concern was not just about Ratima himself, but also about the potential harm that could come to his partner if he were released without proper safeguards in place. During one of his parole hearings, Ratima made a statement that only reinforced the board's concerns. He claimed that he had loved his children and at the time believed he was putting them in a better place by taking their lives. This statement sent chills down the spines of the parole board members, as it suggested that Ratima still harbored a distorted sense of justification for his actions. Rather than fully accepting the gravity of his crimes, his words implied that he had once rationalized them as an act of mercy. The board saw this as a major red flag, an indication that Ratima had not yet reached the level of self-awareness and accountability required for parole consideration. Despite these concerns, reports from inside the prison indicate that Ratima has generally maintained good behavior. He has been described as respectful within the prison environment, and there have been positive reports about his work while incarcerated. Additionally, Corrections has stated that there is no further need for additional rehabilitation programs, as Ratima has already completed the necessary courses. However, even with these positive notes, the parole board has remained firm in its decision to keep him behind bars, stating that good behavior in a controlled environment does not necessarily translate to safe behavior in the outside world. In his most recent parole hearing in the year 2024, Ratima made a significant admission. For the first time in over 3 decades, he acknowledged that the killings were intentional. This directly contradicted his previous claims that the murders were not premeditated. While this confession marked a departure from his earlier statements, it still failed to provide clarity on the most crucial question: why? Despite finally admitting his intent, Ratima refused to explain his motives, leaving the victims' families and the parole board unsettled. During the hearing, he expressed deep regret, stating, "I was a very selfish man for what I did. All I can say is that I really regret full-heartedly the decision that I made in order to kill all those many children and adults. I hate myself for what I've done." However, the parole board remained skeptical. They pointed out that his changing narrative over the years only raised further concerns about his credibility. Given his history of inconsistent explanations, the board questioned whether this newfound admission was genuine or simply another attempt to manipulate the system in his favor. The victims' families continue to oppose his release, maintaining that Ratima has never fully explained his actions or shown true remorse. To them, his admissions mean little without an honest, clear acknowledgement of why he did what he did. Many still believe that Ratima poses a danger to society and should never be granted parole. In response to these concerns, the board recommended that Ratima be transferred to a special treatment unit for violent offenders. However, he resisted the move, arguing that it would be a step backward in his rehabilitation rather than a constructive measure. Despite his efforts, the parole board once again denied Ratima's release. The ruling made it clear that while his latest statement represented a shift, it was not enough to justify granting him freedom. The board emphasized that public safety remained their top priority and that Ratima's risk factors had not diminished to a satisfactory level. For now, Raymond Wayne Ratima remains in prison. His next parole eligibility will come in the year 2025. Whether he will finally succeed in persuading the board remains uncertain. However, given his long history of denied applications, changing statements, and ongoing concerns from the victims' families, his path to release remains as difficult as ever. But what do you think about this case? Do you believe Raymond Ratima should be released, or do his actions and shifting statements prove that he is still a danger to society? Should the parole board continue denying his requests, or do you think he has shown enough remorse to deserve a second chance? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective on this case. And before anything else, I want to give a special shout out to Isabel N. Zeed for the recommendation to cover this case. Thank you so much for your suggestion. If you have any cases you'd like me to discuss, just drop them in the comments and I might cover them next. As always, thank you for watching. Stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one.